Have you ever wondered what happens when tragedy and memory collide on the rugged frontier? In this cinematic Wild West story, Mara lives alone where the sky burned red after a devastating fire reshaped the land. 7 mysterious riders arrive, with saddlebags full of ashes, carrying memories, secrets, and a path to healing. Witness how one woman's courage, a father's watch, and the weight of the past intertwine in a story of loss, discovery, and redemption. This tale explores resilience, the power of forgiveness, and the beauty that emerges even from destruction. A must-watch for fans of atmospheric Western storytelling, dramatic frontier narratives, and emotional journeys across desolate landscapes. The land had never healed after the fire. Even after a decade, the ground still carried the color of coal, the smell of smoke hidden in the cracks of earth. The horizon itself seemed stained, a permanent bruise of crimson that deepened every evening as though the sky itself remembered the blaze. That was why they called this place where the sky burned red. And that was where she lived. Her name was Alara, and she had stopped expecting visitors long ago. The world had narrowed to the 4 walls of a cabin, rebuilt where the old one had. Turned to cinder, and to the grave she kept behind it. The wind sang through the dry grass, carrying with it faint whispers of the flames she once tried to outrun. Sometimes at night, she swore she could hear the crackle still, as though fire had been stitched into the fabric of this land. She kept her father's old rifle propped near the door. Though it had grown more a relic than a weapon, she wasn't afraid of outlaws anymore. What could men take from her that fire hadn't already claimed? Instead, she lived in rhythm with silence, tending what little earth still gave crop, watching the endless red stretch of sky, and listening to the unbroken hush of forgotten country. Yet deep down, there was something she carried heavier than the rifle. A truth she had never spoken aloud, a truth that sat at the center of her solitude. For the fire had not been an accident, and the ashes that still choked this land had not been carried by wind alone. On the evening they arrived, she felt it first in the ground, a faint tremor that was not thunder nor storm, but hooves. She stood in the doorway, hands resting on the frame, as the red glow of the sky deepened into something darker, more ominous. And then, out of the horizon they appeared, 7 riders, shadows against the burning backdrop, their long coats whipping. In the wind, their faces hidden beneath wide brims, each carried saddlebags heavy with something that sagged them low. She did not know yet what weight they bore, but the sight of them pulled at her bones like a memory she had tried to bury. And, for the first time in years, Alara whispered into the silence, "They've come back." The night did not loosen its grip easily, even after the riders tethered their horses and spoke only in low murmurs. Clara felt the silence pressing tighter than the smoke in her lungs. She walked the perimeter of her ruined cabin, fingertips brushing against charred beams, still warm to the touch. Every smell of ash reminded her of something lost. The bread she had once baked in the iron stove, the wood shavings left behind by her father's hands, the warmth of nights spent by the fire when the world outside had been cruel. Now all of it was blackened, collapsed into ruin. She glanced toward the saddlebags resting in the dust. One horse snorted, kicking the ground as if it too was unsettled by what it carried. Clara could not ask not yet. Her voice was not ready. The leader of the 7 stepped forward, a man with long dark hair and a face lined by both years and sorrow. He carried no rifle in hand, only the steady gaze of someone who had walked too many miles through fire and storm. "These are not gifts we bring," he said finally, his voice low, each word dragging through the heavy air. "They are burdens, and they belong to you." His words hung like coals, slow to fade, searing her even before she knew there. "Wait." Clara's hands clenched around the burnt wood she held, her knuckles pale as bone. She wanted to scream, to demand, to force the truth from them, but something inside warned her that the truth would be worse than silence. The men sat near her ruined well, pulling blankets tight against the morning chill. They did not drink, though water glimmered faintly at the bottom. They did not sleep, though their eyes were heavy. They were waiting for her. Clara felt their patience pressing upon her shoulders. She lit a small lantern, though the dawn was breaking, because the light felt like defiance against the ruin. The flame trembled against the breeze, almost failing, and she whispered to it, as if to herself, "Not yet. You don't go out yet." As the sun finally broke over the horizon, the truth began to crawl closer. The riders untied the saddlebags, each worn leather pouch heavy with something more terrible than gold. One by one, they laid them at Clara's feet. The sound of them striking the ground was dull, final, and unbearably heavy. She knelt before them, her breath catching in her chest, knowing before she touched them that these were not possessions. Not tokens, but remnants ashes gathered with care. Ashes of what, of whom, she could not yet say. But in their silence, in their eyes, in the way they would not move until she reached forward, she felt it. Someone she loved was inside those bags. Her fingers trembled as they hovered above the nearest one, afraid to untie the rope, afraid to know. She looked at the men again. Their eyes did not shift away. They were not here to harm her. They were here to deliver a weight they no longer wished to carry. Still, her voice broke when she finally asked, "Whose ashes do you bring me?" The leader lowered his head, hat shadowing his face, and spoke the words she feared most. The night stretched endlessly, heavy with the silence that followed firestorms. Elena had not slept. The cabin walls felt too thin against the memories pressing in. She sat at the window until dawn cracked the horizon open with streaks of bruised crimson. The world outside looked like it still smoldered, and though no flames licked the ground anymore, the ash drifting in the wind made her throat ache. Her father used to say that fire was the only true language of the plains. It burned away lies, left nothing but the truth. But what truth had the last blaze brought her? She was still alive, yes, but life had turned into an unending rehearsal of silence, and every shadow seemed to whisper of the men who once laughed in these valleys before death rode in behind them. When she stepped outside, the earth crackled beneath her boots. The air smelled of soot and iron, and the lone tree she had sat beneath for years was nothing more than a blackened skeleton now, jagged against the sky. She knelt before it, placing her palm on its charred bark, almost expecting it to pulse with memory. Instead, her hand came away blackened with ash. The taste of it coated her tongue, a bitter reminder that nothing endured here, not trees, not people, not even the voices that had once filled the evenings with song. By mid-morning, the wind carried something else besides ash, the faint sound of hooves, distant but steady, traveled through the valley. Elena's body went rigid, and her heart struck like a hammer against her ribs. She rose slowly, scanning the horizon, and there they were, 7 riders, stretched in a line, shadows etched dark against the flaming backdrop of the sky. Their saddlebags sagged heavily, shape shifting inside them with the weight of something she could not yet name. She thought of bones, of relics, of the countless remnants fire left behind when it stole more than flesh. She did not run, nor did she move toward the cabin. Instead, she stood there at the broken tree, her body a thin silhouette of defiance. She remembered the first time strangers had entered her valley after the fire, how quickly the ground had filled with blood, and how silence had swallowed it all once again. This was different. These men moved with a strange patience, as though the land itself had already claimed them, as though they carried something heavier than their own lives. The lead rider broke away first, slowing his horse until the others followed his pace. Elena's fingers brushed against the watch still hidden beneath her coat, her father's last gift, the only thing she had to remind her that time could be stolen, warped, or held tight. She did not yet know what these men carried, nor why the sky seemed to burn brighter with every step they took toward her land. But she felt it deep in her chest, that they had come not just with ashes, but with a reckoning carved into their saddlebags, and soon she would be forced to unearth what the fire had left buried in silence. The valley grew quiet again, save for the rhythm of hooves, ash dancing in spirals around them like forgotten prayers. Alina squared her shoulders, knowing there was no turning back now. The night gave no mercy, only silence thick with the memory of fire. Alina crouched by the fire pit, her fingers blackened as they sifted through the brittle remains of charred wood. Each fragment crumbled into dust at her touch, and yet, somewhere within the ashes, she swore she could still hear whispers, echoes of a home long lost. Her father's voice, faint and broken, drifted between the crackling of her memory. She had grown used to silence, but tonight the silence pressed harder, as though the red sky above sought to remind her that nothing burned without consequence. Behind her, the riders shifted in the shadows, their horses restless, their saddlebags heavy with ashes that seemed more than earth and ember. They carried the weight of grief itself. The leader, a scarred man whose face bore both judgment and weariness, stood watching, his breath steady, eyes fixed not on her but on the fire's ghostly remains. He had said nothing since their arrival, only studied her as though searching for a reflection in her sorrow. Elena's throat tightened, and for the first time in years, she spoke not to them, but to the wind. "Whose ashes do you carry?" Her voice, quiet as it was, made the riders stir. The question cut the silence like a blade, and though no one answered, the truth shimmered in the air. These were not just remnants of homes or villages. They were names, histories. The sky above bled deeper crimson, and the riders, still strangers, seemed bound to her in ways she could neither refuse nor understand. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of recognition. Some part of her already knew these ashes had something to do with her past, with the life she had fled. When the fire first began, the red horizon deepened as Clara stood before the burned-out remnants of the chapel. Its wooden bones jutted from the earth, like the ribs of a long-dead beast, still warm to the touch. Ash clung to her dress and tangled in her hair, drifting on the faint wind as though the fire still lived somewhere unseen. The 7 riders were nearer now, their figures dark against the glow. She watched them descend slowly into the valley, their saddlebags heavy with something she dreaded to imagine. Every hoofbeat echoed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, pulling her toward a reckoning she had tried to outrun since girlhood. She turned the charred rosary over in her palm, its beads cracked and blackened, the cross missing entirely, and wondered if faith had burned away with the rest. The men dismounted in silence, dust rolling up around them. The leader, a tall man with gray hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, stepped forward. His eyes were steady, sorrow carved into the lines of his face rather than anger. He set his saddlebag down on the blackened earth and opened it without ceremony. From within, he drew a small, scorched box and placed it at Clara's feet. She felt the weight of generations pressing down on her, as though the box were made of iron rather than cedar. She did not touch it. She could not. Her breath came shallow, her chest tight. Behind the man, the others stood waiting, their faces hollow, eyes trained on her with a mixture of judgment and something softer pity. Perhaps, though she despised the thought. "Your father," the gray-haired man began, voice like gravel, "stole more than gold. He stole time. He burned it from us year by year when he lit the fires and left us with nothing but ash." Clara flinched. She had heard whispers of her father's sins, but never in such blunt words. He had been a preacher, a man who spoke of salvation. Yet he carried secrets darker than the sky above them now. The man's gaze sharpened. "This," he nudged the box, "is all that remains of what he took. Ashes of families, of homes, of nights that will never come back. We carried them because you needed to see, needed to feel their weight." Clara sank to her knees, the world spinning as she stared at the black dust spilling from a crack in the box. She felt it cling to her fingers when she reached out at last, the warmth of lives extinguished seeping into her skin. A sound rose in her throat, somewhere between a sob and a growl, but she swallowed it down. She would not break before them. Her father's sins were not hers, and yet standing there, with the ashes of strangers staining her hands, she felt marked, as though guilt could pass through blood like inheritance. The riders did not move, their silence heavier than any threat. Clara closed the box, her hand trembling. When she rose again, her voice came low but steady. "If you've come for blood, you'll have to take mine, because he's beyond your reach. If you've come for truth, then sit and tell me what he did." The man's jaw tightened, his eyes searching hers for something, fear, maybe weakness, but finding only fire. Finally, he nodded once. The others eased, their shoulders dropping, though no one looked away. As the red sky bled into night, they formed a circle around the box, around Clara, and the air grew thick with stories that burned, hotter than any flame. The riders had dismounted, their silhouettes long and distorted in the bleeding twilight, while Mariana held her ground on the rise, her hands trembling, but still clenched into fists as though her will alone could command the fire-scarred earth beneath her. They had set their saddlebags in a rough circle, and when the wind shifted, the acrid smell of charred flesh mingled with the ashes spilling out onto the ground, clinging like dust to their boots. One of them, the broad-shouldered man with a scar curling down from his left temple, stepped forward with a deliberate calm, his voice low but carrying as though every word had been waiting years to be spoken. He said her father's name, not as an enemy would, but as a man invoking an oath that had never been broken. And when he said it, Mariana felt her knees weaken, because it was not the voice of hatred but of remembrance, and that shook her more than threats ever could. She asked what they carried, though the answer coiled in her chest before he gave it. Ashes, the remains of a burned town, the very one her father had ridden from in the last years of his life. They accused him of stealing not gold, not land, not cattle, but time. Time that was promised, time that was bargained away in fire and smoke, a debt no coin could repay. The words left Mariana raw because she had lived her life by the tick of his old pocket watch, the last piece of him she had kept close, never knowing that it had once been a ledger of stolen hours. She wanted to shout, to say he was not the man they claimed, but the riders' faces were carved in sorrow, not vengeance, and sorrow was harder to deny. They told her they had carried the ashes across miles of desert, searching for the one who bore his blood, because the sky itself had turned red until she answered for what was left behind. The scarred man's voice dropped softer then, almost pleading, saying they didn't want her life, only the truth. Did she know why the sky still burned each dusk, why the wind still carried ash where no fire burned? Did she know what her father had bargained when he rode away from the smoke? Mariana stood with her throat locked tight, clutching the watch as if its ticking could shield her. But even in her silence she knew the riders had not come for justice, nor for revenge. They had come to place the weight of memory upon her shoulders, and memory weighed heavier than chains. The night thickened with a strange kind of silence, the air heavy not with the soft blanket of rest, but with the weight of unspoken grief. She sat by the fire, though its flames had long since surrendered into ash. Her hands darkened as if the smoke itself had seeped into her skin. The watchful eyes of the 7 riders lingered beyond the ridge, not approaching, not leaving. Their presence stretched across the darkness like a question waiting for its answer. Her breath came slow, shallow, each inhale carrying the scent of scorched earth and the bitter sting of memory. The ashes she clutched slipped between her fingers, pale as bone dust, a fragile substance that once had been someone's breath, someone's flesh, someone's heartbeat. In those fragile remnants, she felt a communion with the dead, an intimacy no living companion could grant. But her thoughts wandered back to her father's warnings, whispered over flames, back to the nights when the horizon glowed crimson, back to the moments she told herself the fire could never reach her. Yet here she was, holding proof that it had swallowed lives whole. She whispered names into the dark, though the wind swallowed them before they could rise. Behind her, a low whicker of a horse broke the stillness. One of the riders dismounted, his boots crunching softly in the brittle grass. He did not draw near, not fully, only stood within reach of her hearing. His voice came low, like gravel shifted by water. "The burden isn't yours alone. Ash does not belong to one set of hands." Her spine stiffened, the words both comfort and curse. She turned, her eyes catching the faint glimmer of his outline. "But it was my land that burned. My people who vanished in smoke, my nights that will never know silence again." The man bowed his head, perhaps in shame, perhaps in agreement. She could not tell. He held no weapon, no offering, only the weariness of someone who had carried too many shadows himself. The others remained on the ridge, silent silhouettes bound together, not by choice, but by shared loss. When she looked back to the ashes in her palms, she thought of how fragile life was, how easily it turned to dust, how quickly fire claimed what was once whole. And still, she could not let them go. They seemed to bind her to the ones lost, and without them, she feared she would unravel entirely. She pressed the ash to her chest, leaving streaks across her skin, marking herself as a living mourner, a keeper of what could not be returned. The fire's faint glow shimmered across her damp eyes, and the riders in the distance seemed to blur with the smoke, ghostly figures fading in and out of the night. The man who had spoken took a single step closer, then stopped, as though the weight of her grief held him at bay. "Ashes scatter," he murmured. "They were never meant to be held." She shook her head, fiercely now, her voice a cracked whisper. "And yet, if I let them go, what remains?" The night gave no answer, only the quiet of horses shifting, their hooves and the brittle whisper of burned grass bending in the wind. Somewhere above, a lone star flickered through the haze, small and defiant. She clung to the ashes tighter. The burden was hers, and for now she chose to carry it. The fire had been out for years, but in that moment, as she knelt on the scarred earth, Clara swore she could still feel the heat against her skin. The 7 riders stood back, as if they knew this place was not meant for their boots or their words, only for her silence. The ashes in their saddlebags had been heavy, not because of their weight, but because of what they meant, and now, spilled across the earth, they seemed to breathe with a life of their own. She sifted the powder through her fingers, feeling the way it clung to her skin before the wind stole it away. It was like holding the memory of someone who had been gone too long, fleeting, fragile, impossible to keep. The red sky above deepened, as shadows lengthened across the plain. The riders shifted uncomfortably, their horses stamping against the ground, but none dared break the stillness. Clara whispered her father's name, the syllables trembling in her throat like something both foreign and familiar. She had not spoken it aloud in years. The ashes seemed to answer, scattering upward in a sudden gust, dancing like sparks even though no flame remained. She remembered the last time she had seen him, standing before the inferno, refusing to leave, telling her the land was his blood, his story, his curse. She had run, but the fire had followed her into every corner of her life. Now it seemed the riders had brought its ending. Or perhaps its beginning. One of them stepped forward slowly, carefully removing his hat as he approached. He did not speak. Instead, he opened his saddlebag again and pulled out a small tin box, dented, blackened at the edges. He set it before her and stepped back. Clara's fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay fragments, buttons, bits of charred wood, the remnants of a pocket watch face, cracked down the middle. She gasped softly, her chest tightening. She remembered that watch on her father's wrist, its steady ticking in the long nights when all she could hear was the wind outside the cabin. It had stopped here, in this fire, in this place where time itself seemed to have ended. The riders still said nothing. Their silence weighed as much as the ashes. Clara pressed the fragments to her chest and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, tears slipped down her cheeks, falling into the blackened soil. She did not know if she wept for her father, for the land, or for the years she had spent wandering with no answer. Perhaps for all of it. And then, without warning, she felt it. The presence of something larger than herself, something tied to the soil, the sky, the flame. The ashes did not just belong to her father. They belonged to the fire itself, to the sky that had burned red and would burn again. The riders had not come simply to return what was lost. They had come to remind her that memory could never be buried, not when it still breathed in every ember. She lifted her head, eyes burning in the twilight, and finally spoke. "Tell me," she said softly, her voice carrying across the plain, "why you've carried this for me. Tell me why now." The leader of the seven stepped forward, his eyes dark and weary. He inhaled slowly, as though the truth itself was heavier than the ashes. "Because the fire is not done with you," he said. She woke before dawn, when the horizon was still half swallowed in smoke, and the first pale light of morning pressed through the black. Every sound outside felt sharpened, the groan of horses shifting, the snap of cooling embers, the rustle of dry ash sweeping over the canyon floor. Mara sat in the doorway of the abandoned miner's shack where they had taken shelter, her father's watch in her palm, the chain coiled like a question around her fingers. The riders slept in uneven rows, but none of them truly rested. Their bodies twitched with dreams they could not shake, and their hands hovered close to the grips of weapons, even in sleep. She thought of Elias then, the youngest of them, the one who carried grief too raw to harden. He had spoken the least, but his eyes told her stories she almost feared to hear. He carried ash not as evidence, not as payment, but as something. Like an heirloom, the last touch of someone who had not been spared by flame. Mara understood that silence better than she wished. She closed her hand over the watch, feeling its familiar weight press into her palm. And for the first time in years she wanted to hurl it far, to see it vanish into the canyon like a stone dropped into an endless well. But she could not. The watch was her inheritance, as cruel as the ashes in their saddlebags were theirs. When the men woke, they moved slowly, as if bracing themselves for the road ahead. The leader, Jonah, a man with scars that looked carved by smoke itself, watched her more carefully now. He asked no questions, only studied the way her fingers clutched the chain as though it could break free from her. "You don't trust us," he said finally, voice low, gravel carried on morning air. She looked at him and almost laughed. "You came with ashes. How am I meant to trust you?" Jonah gave no reply, only nodded as though the answer had always been waiting. The men saddled their horses, brushing soot from leather, their faces painted with streaks of fatigue. When they were ready, Jonah asked her to ride with them, to see the place where the sky had burned most fierce. He claimed the truth would only be found there. She hesitated, but her feet carried her toward her mare all the same, as though some part of her had already accepted the pull of their journey. The canyon opened wider as they rode, and the land stretched into scorched valleys where nothing living dared remain. The soil was black glass in places, hardened by heat so intense it had fused earth into brittle shards. Bones lay scattered, some human, some not half buried under ash drifts that swirled with every gust. The riders carried themselves like men returning to graves they could never leave behind. And Mara, though she had not been part of their burning, felt herself drawn into the same morning. By midday, they reached the ridge of a hollow that once held a settlement. Mara saw the outline of cabins, but only in shadow, for the wood had collapsed into char long ago. At the center, a crooked post jutted from the earth, and from it hung the iron husk of a clock, melted so that time itself had seemed to warp and sag under fire. Jonah pointed to it with a trembling hand. "Your father stood here," he said. "When the fire was set, when the bargain was struck, he took more than gold, more than coin. He stole hours that weren't his to steal. That watch you carry, it ticks on the blood of those who never saw another dawn. The words struck her like the ash-laden wind, leaving her raw, unsteady. Mara clutched the watch to her chest as if it might shield her, but it felt heavier now, almost unbearably so. She wanted to deny him, to call it madness, but the land itself bore witness. She could hear the faint crackle of phantom fire in her mind, the screams carried by echoes in the blackened wood. And she remembered, suddenly, the way her father's eyes always lingered on the watch, not with pride, but with something darker, a hunger he could never sat. Her breath caught, and she whispered, "What am I meant to do with it?" Jonah turned. To her, his face shadowed, ash staining the lines of his cheeks. "That's why we came. To see if you will bury it or if you'll wind it again." The silence that followed was vast, broken only by the shifting of the wind through scorched branches. Mara closed her eyes, hearing the faint, persistent tick within her palm, like a heart that refused to die. The wind blew with the intensity of memory, carrying with it the smell of smoke, earth, and ash that had settled over the canyon like a shroud. Mara's hands trembled, though her posture remained firm atop the ridge, the weight of her father's watch pressing into her palm as if it bore the sins of generations. She had ridden alongside the 7 men for days, moving through valleys of blackened soil and skeletal trees, following the faint trails of fire that had reshaped the land. Each mile had been a revelation, a confrontation with the past she had never fully understood until now. Jonah and the other riders watched her silently, their presence heavy yet patient. They did not need to speak. The landscape itself told the story of what had transpired here. Charred remains of homes, melted iron, and twisted timber testified to the fury of a fire that had spared nothing. Yet within the destruction there was something fragile, a faint green shoot breaking through the ash, a single reminder that life persisted even in the aftermath of devastation. Mara knelt, letting the wind carry the first words of forgiveness she had not known she could speak. She opened the saddlebags, allowing the ash to fall slowly into the canyon, the grains catching the last rays of the sun. Each handful represented a memory, a loss, a debt that had lingered unspoken. The men moved with her, carefully placing their own ashes into the void, a ritual that was at once somber and freeing. Mara felt the weight in her chest shift slightly, as though the land itself acknowledged the reconciliation taking place. Jonah finally spoke, voice low but clear. "It's not the past that defines us, Mara, it's what we choose to carry forward. You've carried more than most could bear, yet here you stand, witness to the truth and ready to shape what comes next." Mara looked at him, at the ridge, at the scorched horizon, and allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The watch, once a symbol of stolen time and burden, now felt like a tether, connecting her not only to her father, but to the resilience and memory that had led her to this moment. She realized the fire had not only taken, it had revealed Dot as the sun sank. Painting the canyon in blood-red brilliance, Mara stood, her resolve unwavering. The 7 riders behind her nodded, understanding that the journey was over, yet the story continued. She would carry the ashes and memories forward, not as a chain, but as a reminder that even in destruction, there is clarity, purpose, and the possibility of renewal. The wind shifted, sweeping across the canyon with a soft, cleansing force. Mara turned toward the path home, the watch still warm in her hand, the riders following in respectful silence. In that moment, she understood that life, like the canyon, would always bear scars, but it was those very scars that gave it depth, meaning, and the possibility for a horizon painted not only with fire, but with hope.